this is really an opportunity for you to ask the panel about any of the questions that have come up, not necessarily from the talks that the panel is being engaged in here, but about any of the things that you think have come up as interesting or difficult or tricky issues that you'd like a view of different people here. And as you can see, we've got a range of people who have been talking about different subjects, so we do expect to get a different set of viewpoints here. So who would like to kick us off with the first question? So I think maybe we've got a couple here, so we'll start at the back here, and then down here, and then over there. So first question up at the back. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of the neural networks that we've been looking at over the course of the last 2-3 days have been kind of explicitly made for certain tasks, and have been quite, are still quite different from the way the brain actually takes in information and learns. They don't have that plasticity, that adaptability. They're defined for specific tasks. I was just wondering if any research is being done by the university for more biologically similar networks, and if there's some value in working from a biological standpoint instead of from a problem-solving standpoint.
Okay, so who would like to pick that one up? Sacha?
Yes and no, in the sense that so looking at human mechanisms has been a source of inspiration and drive for the artificial deep neural networks. Convolutional neural nets, for example, had a notion of receptive field, which came from Geoffrey Hinton looking at the way the retina works and that kind of thing. But then models which are extremely similar to the way the neurons and the brain work are still early days. You have models of spike-firing neurons, or models of what happens in terms of time, the way the time works in the propagation of information to the brain. For the moment, those models are kind of more complicated than they need to be to an extent. There is, on the one hand, you have the biological models which are still slow, computationally extensive, not really convincing. On the other hand, you have something which is, we say it's related to neurons because it's got a notion of connection between small units. It's been vastly simplified compared to the biological models, but it's performing extremely effectively for simple tasks of vision and speech and translation and all that. So we shouldn't stop the biological research, of course not, but for the moment it's the simple stuff which is delivering the biggest improvements.
Regarding the research aspect, there is some research in terms of adaptability in AI and neural network, and the way that they would work is that they kind of train based on different models and different tasks, as we call it, not necessarily regarding, for example, vision or audio, but in a general task that you're looking for. And the goal of the research is that how can you basically switch between these tasks and look into the distribution and how quickly or how correctly you can switch between these tasks. But it is based on research, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. So, there's a lot of work in. There's always value in doing biologically inspired neural networks. Particularly like doing something different that other people aren't doing is, it helps move the field forward. It's good to wide spread of ideas. But fundamentally, right, we've already got 7 billion humans out there, and it would just be really nice to come up with something which thinks differently to us. Right? And like having something which has different strengths and weaknesses to humans is like, it's a huge advantage, right? It lets you pick and choose what you want to do. But also there is a lot of work in adapting the architecture of neural networks and how to tune it efficiently. It's a big growing area of research. A lot of the methods, I'd say, aren't really biologically inspired. They're more sort of hacks at this point. But that's good and that's valuable as well.
Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so probably just so from a social or sort of ethical perspective, I think there's sort of two things I would say as a non-tech person. The first is the simple stuff as it was put, already generates ethical issues. So regardless as to whether we can take AI much further or could take it sort of into an analogy with the biological brain, we already have enough sort of issues to chew on, it seems to me. So simple is already ethically problematic and generates issues. The second thing I would say about all of this is, of course, that with greater adaptability, and I guess that's what sort of the biological brain's thesis is after, right? You don't get these simple tasks anymore, but rather what you get is much quicker adaptability, the ability to switch between different tasks and so on. Of course, what you get with that is greater, it seems to me, flexibility and unpredictability. And there are all sorts of issues regarding risk, probably regarding explainability and so on, that would be quite sort of philosophically worthwhile discussing, it seems to me. But still, the simple stuff already generates, I think, sufficient issues for us to chew on.
Yeah. So there's another question down here. Yes?
Yeah, the same questions I asked at the beginning. In the European Union, in general, that research publications and also other kinds of AI activity is not that competitive compared to China or US, even in terms of technical publications. So what do you suggest for the research community to get funding for technical research? Let's say you do algorithm development and then you have leading positions in the world. What should be done or what is your suggestions for rest of the other places?
I would disagree with the basic statement that one area of the world is doing better publications than the other. Research in this domain is wonderfully collaborative. We have conferences such as, for example, ICASP, where you have researchers from every corner of the planet publishing their results, exchanging ideas, and so on. So, is there really? Yes, in the world, naturally, humans tend to compete and so on. But I think it's quite collaborative. I wouldn't agree that one area.
Actually, there was a report also even for the startup companies. There's about 4,000 startups and 2,000 of them are found almost. They are not using any AI technology, but they are claiming AI to get the funding. So there was a little bit also in the policymaker community also concern regarding the competitiveness of European academic as well as industry compared to our competitors like in US or China. So that was the.
I mean, China's doing really well. It's catching up with Europe, though. It's not ahead. Like, I mean, they've made huge amounts of progress, and there's a lot of research going on. But certainly, like, cutting edge is probably not. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't point to China as like a leading star in AI at the moment. I mean, the amount of investment going into it, it will be shortly, I imagine, but I wouldn't.
What's your measure? Is it number of publications, or when you say cutting edge, what do you mean?
I think it's, yeah, so this is always hard to actually define. It's like, I guess it's number of publications I want to read, right? to be blunt. So there is, the Chinese academic market is incredibly like competitive as well, and there's a huge number of publications and churn going on. And many of the papers are ones which actually they're sort of like incremental, and it's, you know, because they've got so much pressure to publish and to distinguish and move themselves forward. And in terms of like looking for the very interesting papers that stand out, it's like, here is someone doing something new that works. Like, quite often that is not coming from China as much as it is coming from the US or Europe. And I'm sure this is going to change with time, but at the moment it's. I mean, I think they're winning in terms of number of publications probably, but not necessarily at the most high-ranked conferences.
Do you think that could be a signal-to-noise ratio problem? That sometimes it's difficult to find that one gem when there's quite a lot of incremental papers coming out?
Yes, but then, I mean, they submit publications to the same places we do, and so in the same way that I managed to find these papers in CVPR or Eurex or whatever, then I don't really care who the authors are. So I don't think it's just that.
Perhaps one of the issues is that the reviewers and the organisers of the conferences are mostly not Chinese at the moment. So I've seen some of the statistics from, say, the ICASP conferences on one of the technical committees that organises an area. And you can see this graph of large number of papers being submitted by people from China, but not many reviewers to balance that out yet.
I mean, everything is double-blinded in terms of the conferences I go to. So, there is still bias to some degree because people expect a high quality of English, which can exclude some researchers who've got great ideas and just don't have the experience in writing English to get them across.
I wouldn't think that selection is the problem. I think just like there is a notion of economic development, in parallel to that there is a notion maybe of educational development or something. Maybe there is a thing where Chinese academia has to catch up on the rest of the world, and as my colleague said, they're doing well in catching up. So maybe it's just a matter of time.
So perhaps there might be some more questions coming in a moment, but perhaps one other thing related to this is that idea of sort of apprenticeship of knowledge. That you can't just get everything from reading a textbook or coming to a 3-day summer school. Chris?
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, the issues you're talking about is something China is famous for being really good at. They are incredibly aggressive at hiring academics, and they also have a scholarship program where they will happily send Chinese students abroad to do their PhD elsewhere on the condition they come back to China afterwards. So they're doing all the right things in terms of pulling in people, setting up international collaborations and bringing in knowledge from elsewhere.
I mean, maybe Alex, can you say anything about the sort of dangers that people should be aware of and how to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of depends on, if you think about collaboration, I guess it depends on why you're entering into this collaboration, and in particular whether you're entering into a collaboration specifically because your collaborator has lower standards. I mean, you get sort of similar arguments and similar voice, for example, in medical research, medical testing, and so on. So I think you need to sort of ask yourself whether the kind of standards you would be operating with in another environment are sort of still standards in a way that you can sign up to, and that are somehow ethically sound. Sometimes that might not be the case. I mean, sometimes there really isn't a good ethical reason against collaborating with partners from other countries or from other academic systems. Sometimes a collaboration specifically takes place in order to undermine or in order to circumvent particular regulation, and that I think I would view as very kind of morally problematic. I think so. Speaking as someone who's working in the politics department, I mean, we think a lot about regulation. We think a lot about global regulation, and I think there is a real question for global governance there, as to what extent AI-based research or research in general will be given certain global standards. It seems to me if you're sort of just operating at the level of nation states only, you're not necessarily going to get very far, especially in such, I guess, a transferable technology like AI. So I think what we should be looking towards sort of ever more, I think, sort of moving beyond the boundaries of the nation state. Now, you could say at a greater level this is done within the European Union, for example. So the European Union, sort of transcending nation states, is very much interested in developing its own guidelines on AI, development of AI, and utilization of AI. But it seems to me, given where the technological development is going, given to where the funding sits in the world, that we in a way even need to push beyond that. I won't mention Brexit, because I guess this is the kind of the classic case where you have a question of regulatory divergence, of setting up different rules, different standards with regard to economic activity, but it illustrates the point. To what extent does everyone sort of play by the same rules? And those rules, it seems to me, increasingly won't be the rules of individual nation states.
Okay. Another question at the back, yes.
Yeah. So, the past few days we mentioned a few times on the inequality in the aggregation of data in a few companies, and given that current practices, the most prevalent business model online is to get free services with exchange of your personal data, and given also that people fail to see that the value of data is significant, and actually data has value only after critical mass of it has been acquired. What steps do you see, and how do you see the transition on the database economy from that stage that we are now? Because I'm aware of some studies that have been done with people, whether people would be accepting to pay for some services that are already provided for free with exchange of more privacy, and it seems to be a clear case that people will not be willing to pay for anything that has been provided free and retain their data. So how are we going to restrict this flux of data into specific companies and make a more distributed system?
Yeah, I mean that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean that's precisely the problem that we're seeing at the moment. If you look at these big companies like Google, I mean Microsoft is kind of the classic case, because in the 70s and 80s, who in a way managed to establish relative monopolies on data. And it seems to me that policymakers have found it very difficult to develop responses precisely to that. Again, the EU is trying to do something on this front, but of course, I mean it's still in a way not good enough. It seems to me this is really an area where the regulation has to catch up in a way. I guess Facebook, in a way, is an interesting example here. Sort of, if you see how it started out as sort of this kind of benign idea of a social network where people can connect with people they know, they can establish friendship groups, and so on and so forth, and how it then sort of develops into partly kind of a political tool for campaigning. Which no one really, in a way, foresaw, and that just shows in a way how the regulation is lagging behind some of these monopolizing tendencies that we're seeing in the realm of data. That said, I mean, I would say that all states have usually data protection officers. They have usually a legal regulation framework that looks after data. The question is, what do we need in terms of additional steps on top of those frameworks in order to regulate data effectively? So that's going to be the political answer. I guess the personal answer is, what can we do in terms of public education? Are people just cynical and they're saying, yeah, I'm getting the service for free. Sure, I'm giving up privacy, but I'm happy to do that just to get the free service. Or are people generally not aware actually of how much of their data they give up? And I think there's a lot to be said for public education campaign involving sort of technologists, people who work in politics, law, and so on, to kind of, at least have sort of an, how would you put it, sort of a technologically literate or data literate public.
So there is a technological angle to that question as well. I can't remember if it was a company or a research group trying to revert the economical model in the sense that for the moment it's, say, Facebook or the data companies owning your data. But the rationale was people should own their data, and maybe it should be the companies who make business with the data actually paying people for the data. And they were trying to implement, I think it was blockchain-based kind of technology for people to remain the owners of the data and to be to sort of have a distributed. That each member, you, me, and so on, would be a node into a kind of super database where AI businesses who want to do something with the data would kind of tap into. So I just can't remember the name of this company or group at the moment, but there are things like this in the air at the moment.
Is this like the box technology that the BBC are trying something out?
I don't think it was the BBC, but if you remember, we could find that. If you Google that, like kind of open data initiatives and that kind of thing, you will bump into that.
Because I've seen similar things related to analysis of, say, EEG analysis, where you keep your data and a system can query this data and you allow certain queries to happen on that data. Whereas our normal model is that you just give everything into the cloud, into Google or Amazon or whoever, and then they own all of that. And so I think there is an opportunity to think more about how the computation needs to happen and who actually needs to have all of that. And I think Google has been doing some research recently on the federated learning thing. It's not quite the same, but it's still the idea that you've got information in a particular device, and you can be doing the different devices, and the device doesn't necessarily have to transmit all the data into a central database somewhere. I don't know whether Chris or Shirin.
Blanking the guy's name, Andrew something.
Okay, but we won't not have the necessary connection, but there are things out there. Okay, thanks. Question.
Recently, we have seen certain democratization models of certain services like Uber, Airbnb, and things like that, and look like if we are moving toward a future in which I will be connected to someone and I don't need any intermediary kind of person, and AI will be controlling all that behavior. Do you think this model will even exist within academia as well? Like especially in the domain of teaching, I don't need university to teach, go to there. Maybe universities will only be for research possibly, or maybe research will also be democratized, like researcher will be like freelance or.
So, I mean, maybe Shirin, you don't need to do your lectures anymore. People will just link into your videos and then teach to people. So.
I mean, teaching is kind of difficult to answer that question, but in my opinion, because you don't go there as a teacher just to teach them the material. You go there to encourage them to be active, to learn teamwork and communication. I'm not sure how much they can learn if we go for all, AI-based, for example, learning, and not being within the environment of teaching. I'm sure the idea of learning from very great lectures, different sources of information, different lecturers, it could be there and it will definitely be there, but I'm not sure if it can replace the whole idea of teaching in person.
Chris, anything
I don't know, I think it's kind of outside I'm not enough of a sociologist to answer it well. Yeah, I mean, mostly what you said, there's more to teaching than just standing at the front of the class and lecturing, and forming personal contact with students and stuff. I mean, to some degree, where lecturing can be replaced with different sources of material, that frees you up to do more personalised teaching, I guess. I see probably things are going to change rather than universities will disappear, I guess.
Can I just answer this question? His question. As a social scientist, I've sort of worked on these areas, so just to sort of answer your question, I think there's no substitute for a face-to-face interaction in education, and whilst you can have virtual learning or online learning, I think it's always much more productive when you are able to interact, go back, think about it, come back and ask more questions, and I think that's the strength of real-time in-person learning, and I don't think that could be replaced. That's just my understanding. And
like previously, you used to go to some kind of place to eat something. Like currently, that is happening. Some human is delivering some food at your, and similarly, the taxi also is being replaced by Uber. The same operation is there. Human thing is there, but it's being regulated by AI. So similarly, let's suppose the professor live in my street, so why I go to university to take lectures? Maybe he is free in the evening. I can something learn face to face from him.
There are two things. So one, is it possible to imagine a business model where education would become online and on demand? It's already done. So you have Apple University, you have Coursera, you have Open University, you have all sorts of brands doing online learning. Now there's another thing that seems to be your question, which is AI is controlling that or regulating that. No, AI in Uber is just there to match the closest driver to your thing. So it's more like a facilitator. It's not like AI would somehow control education someday or something. When it comes to AI playing a role in facilitating online learning, yeah, why not? Is that going to be threatening the traditional teaching? Perhaps not. If the face-to-face interaction is going to work better, is there going to be competition between on-demand online learning and face-to-face learning? It's already there. So.
But I think the question is, it should be more, and you may not be able to answer it because you are academics yourselves, but do you foresee disruption in this model of teaching, which has been an established model for centuries? Now, if we were sitting 10 years ago and people said that, okay, you don't have to book a taxi or you don't have to hail a cab in the street, you can do it from your device in your hand, you would have thought they were crazy, right? And taxi drivers would never have 10 years ago even been able to imagine that. So I think what the question probably is looking at is, could there be a disruptive change in the delivery of education? And the answer is yes, but that disruption hasn't yet arrived.
There is a change. Now the question is it disruptive? for the moment.
Because Coursera and online, that's just incremental. That's not disruptive. That's incremental ways of learning. So that's like distance learning.
Right? It's just that it had this cascading effect that you don't see immediately. Because Uber is just a mini cafe, just done at scale, right? And so like it's an incremental change which has had these huge knock-on effects.
But it doesn't own any cars. As yet, it doesn't employ the drivers.
No, it says it doesn't.
Right? So, it's not.
But also, there are some things that they don't necessarily work with the dynamics. So, some of the people that I follow on Twitter said, well, they're getting a bit fed up with Uber because you pre-book something and then they get cancelled just 5 minutes before it's supposed to arrive because they found some better fare somewhere else, maybe. And so, actually, I'd much rather rely on my local taxi firm that I know is going to turn up because they always do it. So, I mean, it sort of depends on, a lot of these things can end up being, the dynamics have got to be right as well. And those are very tricky to do, and the AI won't always solve everything.
I think
I was just going to give Alex a chance to come in because from a politics department, the dynamics of engineering, we tend to have, quite lecture-heavy courses. Whereas, humanities departments, famously, you hardly ever see your students except for one thing.
They do come beat on your office door. Now, I mean, I guess we have a slightly different model in the sense that our students have to read a lot, and there's only so much you can do. At some stage, you just have to sit down and read the material. But I would say, sort of one thing, disruptive change, yes. And I think the point of disruptive change is that it's very, very hard to predict how exactly it's going to happen and how it's going to disrupt. And I guess this is sort of something general that we have in thinking about the future. That very often when we think about the future or what disruption might be, we have in mind kind of our present or the kind of events of the past. But they might be a very, very bad guide to future events and to disruption. So just sort of two examples basically. If you look at 9/11 and the terrorist attacks of 9/11, people flying airliners into buildings, that sort of seems to disrupt in a way the way in which we've previously looked at terrorism and the means of perpetrating terrorism. If someone had told you in 1995, 1996, where there have been specific experiences, for example, with Irish Republican terrorism in the UK, or with sort of left-wing terrorism in continental Europe, that in 2001 people would fly airplanes into buildings. People plant bombs and they have car bombs and they have phone calls before that, and so on. So there's a disruption. You can't really predict it because it's sort of applying in a way contemporary standards. So will there be disruption in higher education? Yeah, absolutely. Do we know what it's going to look like now? Because there's a very point of disruption. The one thing I would say, just to calm our nerves as academics, as we are employed by this institution, one sort of thing universities have going for themselves is that they can award degrees and that they have sort of specific degree awarding powers. So the question with the sort of more flexible AI model is, yes, you can get knowledge sort of from everywhere. Knowledge is sort of dispersed, but can you actually pull this together that you get something that awards you a degree? Would there be an authority somehow backed up by the law that has the specific authority to give you something, not just impart knowledge in whatever way possible, but to give you something, namely a degree? And at the moment, sort of universities are the legally recognized and authorized knowledge providers to give you degrees. So that's what we get going for us, is you can give out degrees or graduation ceremonies.
But I think that there may be some areas where things are not quite so clear-cut. So as I understand in law, for example, there are some types of qualifications that might be provided by providers like BDP, for example, where it's not quite on the traditional university model, and it works more in the sort of bite-sized learning type thing. And I think that seems to be where on-the-job learning probably has been things where things have changed. That you used to just talk to colleagues or read a book to learn about how to do a particular thing. Now you can watch a 15-minute YouTube video and learn about how to do recursion in Python or something. So that's the sort of level where you don't end up with a degree at the end of it, but you are able to program and demonstrate your stuff to somewhere which might help you to get your next job.
But would it be without sort of something in a way authoritative behind it? I wonder. If you just say, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos on a specific type of programming, can I please have a job? I can see how that would work if you're already in a job and your employer, for example, tells you, do this, do that. But when it comes to qualifications,
but sometimes the the assessment could be as part of an assessment day where you'll need to do programming. In that case, it's demonstrated by the Chris.
Because like Coursera is already doing this. So at the moment they've moved to this model where many of the lectures are free and then you pay for a test at the end. And they give you a piece of paper and they say they can do this up to the standard we hold. And then it's on the employer to decide if it's actually valuable.
Perhaps in order to calm your nerves a bit better as well, I think that it's true that employers partly look at the fact that you've trained people to do certain things, but the other thing that employers look at and get from universities is the fact that simply you're good at choosing bright young people. Just the fact that you chose that group of people and that they did do great.
But is that
what they are using you for?
is that a good measure? So within the research community, we also have discussions about the fact that you've published in a particular journal that has what's called an impact factor, which is sort of roughly how many times papers in that are cited by papers. Is that a good measure of how important that publication is, just because you have to publish it in there? There are social aspects of there of somebody from a particular social background might never think of going to a particular university, or they might never get selected, but actually they've done really well in the university that they are. So shouldn't we be measuring the outputs rather than the inputs from there? So I think there are still challenges in that space. I want to give another couple of people a chance who haven't had a question yet. One over here.
So for the time we had the perceptron, the normal neural networks, but now the CNN. Because each and every time we had some barriers that stopped us from reaching some solution. Now my question is, the current AI, can it learn anything? If not, what it can't learn? And what are the steps that are currently progressing?
Chris?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think the standard answer is like, given a sufficiently expressive architecture and enough data, you can learn anything. Right? But the catch is that basically you need to have seen so many things that you've basically seen this before, and you can recognize it as something that's really good. What's always harder and harder, and this is where the field seems to be progressing as we get better at learning, is how can we abstract? Right? How can we, from a small amount of data, how can we generalize well to examples we haven't really seen before? How can we generalize to new problems which we haven't dealt with? And these are like some of the big issues of like, can we build something sufficiently flexible that it can generalize from one concept to another.
Another research areas regarding that question is that machines or AI should actually pick up what to learn and what not to learn, because with including every information within the learning, they could be actually more confused, and some elements might actually misguide them. So it is very challenging that machines learn what not to learn, but it is a very big area of research.
Sacha?
Yeah, to an extent there has been a lot of recycling of architecture, GNN architectures which came from computer vision, and we're far from having invented every possible DNN architecture. So probably also a proportion of the innovation will come from coming up with new architectures which are more adapted to certain problems. For example, convolutional neural nets were designed to cope with environmental rotation. That's a thing that you don't need to cope with when you're in sound. You don't have rotation, notion of rotation in sound. So we haven't invented everything. So there might be new architectures coming up which are specialized to other problems than vision.
Alex, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I can just say this as non-technology. You can all take the mickey out of me, that's fine. But so isn't there something about human behavior where we know certain things or can anticipate certain behavior without first having learned about it and without first having experienced it? And that's sort of hard to replicate in a machine. So to give a very daft example, so if I sat here next to Chris and would just sort of pour a glass of water over Chris would get very mad at me, of course. Now, I've never ever done that, but I know it would happen, and that's why I wouldn't do it. I mean, isn't this sort of something sort of predictive that we have in our own predictions that we can make about social situations, which we haven't directly experienced or never have poured a glass of water over anyone, at least not on a panel, right? And so I'm wondering whether there is sort of an intuitive social understanding of how certain actions might or might not pan out that doesn't really sort of require data or experiential learning that can't readily be replicated by a machine or by an AI. But I'm talking as a non-tech person.
I mean, this is one of the areas where human intuition is very misleading, right? Because what you actually have is you have decades of experience of social situations, and you've seen many different ways of infuriating people. You know, sufficient experience to, if I pour water on people, this is something they would consider annoying, and therefore they would react in this particular way. And so much of this is learned, right? This is not behavior you'd expect from a baby. A baby would happily throw water over anyone, even if they're in a pan. So the fact that it feels natural and it feels like I know this without being taught it, well, actually you have been taught a lot of this, so it's tricky.
Okay, at the back, I don't think you've had a chance to ask a question.
How optimistic are you that AI will have the potential to create new jobs, or do you think some sort of universal basic income will have to be introduced inevitably at some point?
Alex,
the universal basic income. I mean, people are very keen on it. So I'm not a great fan of universal basic income, but precisely because it seems to me a very convoluted process of making people better off. Precisely, you would sort of give everyone a universal basic income, but then you would have to take parts away. Then you would have to take parts of that income away from the very rich who don't really depend on it. So you would have to start taxing people. It also seems to me sort of very convoluted. Again, I think there is a point about disruption here. Right, we don't exactly know how the future is going to pan out with regards to the job market. So you see, all these kinds of predictions. AI is going to kill a lot of white-collar jobs and so on. There might be mass unemployment that might come from the middle classes and so on and so forth. And to be honest, we can't really tell. I think what a lot of these predictions go by is the experience with deindustrialization and automation in Western society since the 1970s and especially since the 1980s. Of course, that led in many ways to mass unemployment, that led to a decline of the working class and so on and so forth. But it's questionable whether the experience that we have of, in a way, new technologies and automation disrupting the labor market from the 1970s and 80s, whether that is really applicable to future disruption from AI. Again, I would say we don't know how this is going to pan out. But I could, imagine it. I mean, that's probably trivial to say. I mean, I can imagine it creating new jobs as well as, destroying older jobs. I mean, that's just how an economy and a labor market functions.
Yeah, I second that, and precisely during the scenario session, we precisely had a debate where if a completely automated system could do the speech to text in another language kind of translation, would you still need the human in the loop? Or in other terms, can you force AI to be assistive rather than replacing human tasks? And that indeed we don't know. I mean, there is a wish for AI to be benevolent and to help humans, but then who is holding the power on that? Businesses most of the time, one of the selling arguments is this is going to reduce your cost. What costs most is people's salaries. So where is that all going to go? So it's an assemblage. The interesting thing about this summer school is precisely we have all the societal aspects and ethical aspects laid out. Now, who is holding the power on that, and where is it all going to go? Fortunately, we have the goodwill of making it go in the right direction, but God knows if AI is going to steal people's jobs or augment humans in ways which are going to create more jobs. We all wish that it's going to go for the human augmentation and assistance, but we don't know at this stage. And we need to be the watchman of that. I mean, precisely as AI practitioners, it belongs also to us to steer things in a direction where it's constructive rather than destructive.
Okay, so I think we've got time for maybe one last.
Just building upon exactly on this, can we use another AI to predict that will AI steal jobs or will it create jobs? And can we use another arbitrator to know how that prediction will go in right way or wrong way?
Sure, and depending on who you ask to do it, we can make it give you whatever answer you want. So, I mean, this is the problem, that we genuinely don't know what's going to happen, right? We can't make a prediction. Saying, let's use AI to make the prediction for us doesn't fix these issues, right? It's not a magic wand. And so, yeah.
Let's suppose we have, like, we put historical data of all those events, and somehow AI see the patterns, like if this event happened, usually after a while that event happen also.
But, I mean, you know, if you can do this, why do we need an AI to do it? Like, shouldn't an economist be able to do this already?
So because maybe economists can't scan all those documents, they don't have all these streams of data, biological, economists, political, and...
I just don't think we have enough. I don't think having all the past data is enough to actually fix that we don't know what's going to happen next.
So I think we've got one more burning question at the end, and then we begin the session. So.
Yeah, it's a bit of a high-level question. It seems to me that the main assumption under the whole story of deriving value of data is that your data is descriptive of the distribution in reality, and also that your data is going to remain descriptive and relevant in future. So given that most of the data that we have at the moment is being produced by the last few years, how do we know that the total application of AI in whatever, and this also is relevant, mostly is relevant into social issues, is going to limit us into conceive of new scenarios, given that it can only regress back to the data that we feed it, which itself is only produced in the last few years. That's the question.
It depends. You can bake the data updates into the system. When I was working at Nuance, we would be retraining the models every so often. I think it was every 3 months or 6 months, to track the changes in the properties of the phone lines when doing voice mail to text transcription. So by design, you can make sure that your system tracks the evolution of the data.
Yeah, but the difference is that once you create an AI system that creates some value, then it also participates in the creation of new training data, which is not how it would happen if there was no AI system in the first place. So it has some kind of input in providing maybe a limit in the imagination of new scenarios. I don't know if I'm really clear in this, it's asking, maybe it's not valid.
But I sort of suggesting that the AI takes a snapshot of current data, and there's a kind of question, because that snapshot is limited in time, to what extent it's relevant to the future, or to make future.
Yeah, so an example would be all of those cases where an AI ends up being racist because of the data that we give it is coming from a particular period in time where this data is racist itself. How can we be sure that we will not be limited in imagining new scenarios if we incorporate a lot of AIs that rely heavily on data coming from a specific period, and it will not limit us?
We would sort of assume, I guess, sort of a racial society. Those would be the kind of predictions or models or whatever we get from it, rather than, for example, a post-racial society,
yes,
or a racist environment. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
One way to add information to the AI that you have currently within the past limited data is adding explainability. So, based on what your algorithm decided something, and if it's going to be, changing or still the same and still is relevant in the near future, then you can still consider those elements. And if you making it explainable is very difficult, but if you can make it that way, it could be more adaptable when saying some new features or some, major changes within your data.
Just to follow up, this is not a hypothetical. There's been research which has shown that if you give people good explanations for classifier, they can pick out a classifier which will generalize well to new data, because we have prior knowledge about how things should be working. And exactly as said, you can show people can use this to pick a classifier which will work better on unseen data from a new distribution.
Okay, well, I think actually we've really come to the end of the panel discussion, so we can keep to time. But I'd very much like to thank all of the members of the panel again. So thank you very much.